Hello everybody, welcome back to my channel. I'm Mustard Saves and welcome back to week 2, or part 2, I'm sorry, of my 1 week of $30 to feed 2 people grocery budget challenge. And I wanted to give you a little preface before we start that number 1, I'm a home chef. Like many of you guys, I've learned how to cook from other people, like maybe some family members, and I've also learned from YouTube how to make a lot of things. So if you're following me for recipes, you're following somebody who followed somebody else to make a couple of these things. So as a heads up, I just was trying to report this as somebody who was trying things. Like there's a couple of things in this video that I'd never made before. So I wanted to try and show you guys that like anyone can try it and see what happens, right? Number 2, I am not a nutritionist, so this week's meals may not be the most nutritionally balanced. They may be missing something, and of course, if you were working with any bigger or smaller budget, you would adjust to that. And speaking of budget, if you are trying to stick to this $30 meal plan because you are struggling to support yourself financially, and you need assistance, please reach out to your local food pantries, food banks, churches, schools. See what your community has to offer to help you. They are not there to judge you. They definitely only care that you are being fed with what they're able to provide you. And then for the final thing that I want to address is I want to address the topic of spices. I have a very full spice cabinet right now. The house that I've moved back into my house, like the house that I grew up in, and in that time several family members have come and gone living there. So our spice cabinet is really like stupid full right now. So I'm not buying any more spices, but it's just accumulated from people who have been in and out. And I thought to allow myself the full spread of the spices, but I ended up keeping it very simple so you are more able to follow this. And also, I feel that spices should be kept in like a separate budget because you can definitely do a lot of damage with $5 every month. Like get a garlic powder, an onion powder, and an Italian seasoning, and you can do a whole lot with those 3 things. But I kept it pretty simple. You'll see that I didn't reach for too many. I think I reached for maybe like 4 or 5 different spices total. And also, I did not have to pick up a can of crushed tomatoes in my grocery list because I had crushed tomatoes at home, and the can that I used did have basil already in it. It's a very bougie brand of crushed tomatoes that I used, but I didn't buy it because I'm bougie. I bought it because I saw it at Dollar Tree, and for $1.25 that can is normally $5. Yeah, I bought it so that way I could have it. So yeah, those are all the prefaces that I wanted to give to you guys before we went on to go see what I made with this stuff. So without further ado, let's go see what I made with it. The first thing that I did when I got back from the grocery store was to get some beans going on the stove. For the pinto beans, I make them the way my grandma taught me, not the way the internet tells me. So to start, I've got a big pot of water boiling off screen while I sift through the bag and make sure to pick out any bad beans or even straight up rocks that I find. You can use a piece of paper to put the beans on and transfer them into a bowl, but my sink is big enough to just use the cutting board as a diving board to kind of just shove them off into the bowl. This bag was actually pretty good, and I only found a few sunburnt beans and no rocks. If you find some beans that have been split in half, those are completely fine. They just got jostled around a bit in the packing process. The next step is to give your beans a good washing. Just fill your bowl with a decent amount of water and swish them around, and just rinse and repeat until the water runs clear. And as a pro tip, if you've got a garden, you can keep the wash water and use it to water your plants. So that's why I kind of have a little separate bowl on the side. And since I'm already here, I also took the opportunity to sort, wash, and soak my bag of Great Northern beans as well. These beans, I'll actually want to let them soak for at least an hour before I start cooking them. The pinto beans, however, are being drained and dumped directly into a big pot of boiling water for about an hour. Once they're in the pot, you don't want them to touch any more cold water. If you find that you need to add more water, you'll want to boil it on the side beforehand. And once the hour is up, the beans probably won't be completely cooked, but now is the time that you'll want to add in about a tablespoon of salt per pound of beans. You can, of course, adjust this to your taste, but I find that if you don't salt them at all at this point, they don't quite taste right in the end. And you will want to wait a second before tasting the beans before adding more salt, because it does take a second for the salt to move from the broth and into the actual bean bodies themselves. And around this time, my white beans had gotten themselves nice and plump, soaking in the water, so I put them on the stove to cook. And while those were going, I got started on dinner for day one. Off camera, I scrubbed a few potatoes clean and got them chopped up into wedges. Normally, I would peel my potatoes and skip the scrubbing out of pure laziness, if I'm being honest, but since I was down to the wire with the budget, I decided it was worth it to keep the skins on. For the seasoning, I kept it pretty simple with just some garlic, salt, and pepper, and some oil to help the seasoning stick. Then it was into the air fryer at 400 degrees for about 25-ish minutes with a jostle about halfway through. Back to the beans, I drained off whatever liquid was left, but I did keep it in a bowl for later. To the beans themselves, I tried using my hand blender to blend the beans smooth, but a food processor or an actual blender definitely would have been more efficient. I ended up with something that could have definitely been achieved with your standard potato masher. As you can see, once my bean mush had cooled down, it actually thickened quite a bit. So here at this time, I threw in my whole jar of pesto and some salt and pepper. If you add the pesto in while the beans are still too hot, you may end up losing some of the flavor from the basil, so you do want to wait for it to cool down a little bit. And now, to finally make all these pieces make sense, I have a large tortilla that I've toasted up a little bit to make a nice pesto-flavored bean and potato wrap. In this case, I chose Great Northern beans because I wanted a bean that didn't necessarily have a strong flavor on its own, so that the pesto could shine through. The potato gave the wrap some more structure, and the tomato is to have a nice fresh vegetable included. I served it up with a cut up apple and a movie, and we had ourselves a very delicious first meal of the week. In later iterations of this meal, I actually ended up slicing up some of my cabbage to give the wrap some crunch, and a good amount of mustard to give it something sour. If you have pickles, it would be like killing two birds with one stone on that aspect, so if you have anything else, I definitely think it would only benefit this wrap to add other types of vegetables. For breakfast, I was so excited to try out this soy chorizo. There is another brand that I used to be completely obsessed with, but my H-E-B stopped carrying it, and even in all my travels around Texas, I haven't been able to find it. So I was very hopeful to find this new kind of chorizo to rely on. My boyfriend and I haven't really been in the mood for sweet breakfasts lately, so as a savory option, I fried up the chorizo and then added in half of the pinto beans I'd cooked up the day before, along with a can of diced tomato and green chili. When you're reheating beans, a lot of the thick gravy that they're set in will actually melt back down to a watery consistency, but I found that I still wanted to thin out the beans a little bit more, so instead of using plain water and potentially losing flavor, I used the broth that I'd saved from cooking the white beans. Now you're just going to want to let everything warm up and let all the flavors mingle, and you've got yourself a very basic pot of vegan charro beans. And you guys, this was so freaking good. We ended up just eating a bowl of straight beans for breakfast, and in later iterations, you'll see we did serve it over white rice, but this was a very delicious base recipe that I will very much be wanting to make again. And I think in terms of flavor profile, this would have gone much better with like some cornbread. For recipe number 3, I'm going to be making some very basic steamed buns inspired by Chinese bao. The most common bao are stuffed with a pork and cabbage mix, but just like tamales, there are plenty of other types of filling you can choose from, so I went with cabbage, potato, and mushrooms. There's always going to be a lot of dirt on fresh mushrooms, so I'm just using a damp kitchen towel to give them a little wipe down, and then I used my food processor to get them nice and finely diced up. I did the same thing with a potato, and I probably should have done the same with the cabbage, but my food processor is so small, and I was already over it, so I just decided to keep them in the strips that I had cut them up in. And once everything was all chopped up, I sprinkled in about a tablespoon of salt to help draw out the moisture from the veggies while I started on the wrapper. Into a bowl, I plopped 3 cups of flour, about a teaspoon of salt, and then just enough water to turn it into a dough. I'm not really the best at figuring out how much water doughs really need. I always end up adding too much water, so I used a fork until it looked like it was just about to form a complete dough, and then I just tipped it all onto the counter to knead it together. And if you can see the little random bits mixed into the dough, there's not random junk. This is the same bowl that I used to make my potato wedges, so you're kind of just seeing little bits of black pepper. And once the dough was all nice and formed, I tossed another damp kitchen towel over the bowl to let the gluten relax and make it easier to roll out. So while I was waiting for that, I returned back to my filling, and as you can see, a lot of water has come out, plus extra when you squeeze it. Then to dry it out a little more and to make sure the potato is cooked all the way through, I'm also taking a second to fry off the filling in a frying pan. And since there's no meat in here, giving the veggies a chance to brown is another way to get some extra flavor into the mix. Alrighty, now that all this prep is over, it's time to actually put these things together. I'm no real expert in making buns or dumplings of any kind, but I did want to show you what can happen if you overstuff them. Not only are they very ugly, but the skin is so stretched and stressed that they can be very difficult to handle and might even break while you're cooking them. From this amount of dough, I got 8 buns filled with a half a cup of filling each. And for funsies, I did get out some of my Pinto beans to fill one of them up, and I marked it with a little sprinkle of chili powder on top. And to cook them, I lined a steamer basket with a piece of parchment paper so that the dough wouldn't stick to the pan, and then I kept the lid on for about 20 minutes. The internet said 15 would be enough, but I got nervous and I kept them for the full 20. And here's what they looked like at the end. We definitely did not eat all 8 of these buns in one sitting. We got through maybe about half of them, and the bean one was really delicious. All of these were so good, and I will definitely be making something like this again in the future, but I'll probably add like yeast to the dough so that way it gets like nice and fluffy and bouncy when you steam them. But as a base set, this was actually very good. At some point, I also made spaghetti. I just wanted to include something really easy, and the only difference I made was that I measured out a cup of dried lentils and boiled those on the side to add to the pasta and give the meal an extra dose of protein. Hello, welcome for an intermission. I am here again just because this clip, I don't want you to have to sit through it. It was midnight and I was having to talk really quiet so I didn't wake up people in the house, but I did want to explain what I was trying to tell you is that I had an apple that went bad. Like, there was no saving this apple. And so in an effort to use up the apples, I knew I needed to process them quickly, because there was a couple who were kind of starting to look like that. There were some that were certainly still good. But yeah, the apples, I needed to do something with them. So here is the clip of what I ended up doing with them. One of the content creators I've been following for a very long time is a Chinese woman whose channel is named Jianxi Xiaoge, and like 4 years ago, she made a video of her making these flaky cakes filled with rose jam. I'll leave the video linked in the description, but basically she made 2 doughs. One was made mainly with water, and the other only had lard as its liquid. Then she wrapped the 2 doughs together to create layers of the 2. In baking terms, you'll see this kind of technique called laminating, and it's usually done with butter or margarine, but for the confines of this challenge, I wanted to stick to using vegetable oil as my only fat, and I decided to try it out anyway. I have no real recipe for what I ended up with. I'm not sure if you can tell from the video, but for me, this was actually a little difficult. For whatever reason, my outermost layer didn't want to stick together, so I thought the whole thing wasn't working. And I was really expecting for these to just fall apart and be a huge mess, but I pushed on anyway. To cook these, I didn't want to turn the whole oven on for 2 little Pop-Tarts, so I just put them in my air fryer, and they actually turned out really well. An egg wash or even a layer of honey brushed on top would have given them a little more color, but for my first attempt without a recipe or any real skill at baking, I took these bad boys as a win. The crust wasn't particularly sweet, but the filling more than made up for it, and since I'd had enough dough to do this a few more times, I did take the opportunity to experiment with other fillings like peanut butter and chocolate and peanut butter and jelly. When it came down to it, the apple was probably our favorite, but I think I would have chosen the peanut butter and chocolate one if it had some banana to put in it. So this was a really cool experiment, and I'm honestly really glad that I tried making these. Now, on to the last time I cooked for this week. I made some lentil dal. I've got the remainder of my onion and garlic, along with a tablespoon each of cumin, garam masala, and turmeric, with a teaspoon of salt. Followed shortly by the remainder of my bag of lentils that I had washed and soaked for about an hour, and just enough water to cover them. Contrary to popular belief, naan is not usually served in everyday meals in South Asian households. So while my lentils were going, I again tried making something new and attempted to make roti. Roti is supposed to be made with whole wheat flour, and just like tortillas, it can take many years of practice to make them well by hand. Between the right consistency of the dough, the technique of rolling them out, and figuring out what the best temperature to cook them at is, these aren't as easy to make as one would think, but overall, I tell myself that I did an okay job. Once you take them off the pan, you're going to want to cover them in a kitchen towel to help them steam and soften up, and then also prevent them from drying out and turning into a tostada. I served the dal with some rice, and my final comments on this attempt was that number one, I either burnt my spices or I overspiced the meal because I did have a little bit of a bitter aftertaste. I think the answer is a bit of both because I forgot to consider the cup of lentils I'd subtracted to use to make the spaghetti. And second, like I said, my roti were okay, but they didn't keep very well. I kept them wrapped in the towel inside of a sealed container, but they just got really chewy and kind of hard to eat the following day. So viewers, please beware of my mistakes, and you'll probably want to actually use wheat flour. But if you're going to use all-purpose like I did, I think they're perfectly fine to make that day that you're going to eat that meal. And here we are at the end of the video. Here is a clip of what I ended up with at the end of the week. I forgot to include, I also ended up with about a quarter of the head of cabbage left. And I actually ended up with a lot more leftover than I thought I was going to. Specifically because we did not end up eating 3 meals a day. In fact, we mostly ate 2 meals a day. And I mostly attribute that to our activity level. Like, we're not particularly active. We don't have jobs right now that really require us to be particularly active. Depending on the day, I'm not particularly hungry during breakfast time, so by the time lunchtime rolls around, I am hungry. Also, I'm only 5'2", so I may have different caloric, whatever, based on my body makeup than you would. So we did end up with a lot of food left over. And as you can tell, I'm a little... You guys know. Anyway, I did actually lose some weight during this week because I really wanted to stick to only the items that we bought, and I was trying to realistically, ask myself, am I hungry? So I did lose like 2 pounds over the course of this week. I don't want to say that I was necessarily intentionally restricting myself calorically. I think I was just paying attention to what I was eating, because I do have a tendency to overeat, and that's why she looks like this anyway. Another thing is that I didn't really get sick of anything that I was eating. Everything was really good. The spaghetti in the middle of the week was such a game changer. Like, I was so happy that I included that because it kind of broke up all these other meals that kind of took a lot of prep work but were still delicious. The 2 meals, no, 3 meals that I don't think I would ever get sick of eating were those wraps. Those wraps are really good. The beans, the pinto beans that I made like churro style, so good. And then the spaghetti, because I love spaghetti. The buns, the steamed buns, those were really good, but they did take a second to put together because, you know, you had to prep all the vegetables and get their dough ready and all that stuff. Delicious, but did take a minute. And then for the dal, I made that near the end of the week, so I didn't even really get time to get tired of it, if that makes sense. Like, it was only on the menu for like 2 days. So yeah, in all, I would say this was a much larger success compared to the $20 that I did earlier. I'm not going to link that video. It's on my channel. I did try to do a $20 grocery budget challenge, but 1, I was not very good at making videos, and 2, whatever I chose, my stomach did not agree with, so I'm not going to recommend that one. But anyway, for this one, I felt fine. You know, I didn't feel particularly hungry. I will say the number one thing though is that since everything had to cook, like I had to cook it myself, make sure that you are cooking before you're hungry. There was definitely a couple of times where I was like, oh yeah, I should probably start making dinner or whatever, especially when I was waiting on those beans. And there were moments where I was already hungry, but I hadn't finished cooking dinner yet. So I definitely think that is another like plus to if you want to meal prep everything at the beginning of the week. I even ended up freezing some of the pinto beans because it was 2 pounds of it and I didn't want the other half of them to go bad while I wasn't using them. So you can freeze a lot of the things that I cooked this week. So yeah, that is the end of my challenge. I definitely think $30 in my area is doable. I live in Texas where our minimum wage is $7.25. So if you live somewhere with a higher cost of living, scale this to your $30 equivalent, and I think it's fine. I think it's doable. How do I think it will affect your health in the long term, physically or mentally? I'm not sure. Another thing to say about that is that there were things that I don't usually make or don't usually keep in the house, but I found that since I was trapped, I don't want to use that word, but since I was inside the confines of my $30, there were things that I wanted to make or wanted to have that we don't even usually keep in the house. So I don't know what that would do to your mental health in the long term. Do I think this is a good way to start? Yes, because I did end up with a lot of stuff left over that you could build on for future weeks. But anyway, that is the end of my little experiment, and so I hope you guys enjoyed. I hope you guys got something out of it. Again, if you are following this meal plan because you are in financial need of assistance, please reach out to your local resources, food banks, food pantries, schools, churches, wherever you can to try and get some assistance, because these people really only truly want to help you. And so, yeah. As always, if you guys have any questions, please leave them down in the comments. If you like the video, please leave a like. And if you want to see more money saving content, please subscribe to my channel. And I'll see you guys in the next one.